maple syrup.
I think it got a little longer.
I don't know if it got longer. I think it's like 8 chords instead of 4 chords. I just doubled it. It really wasn't an effort. It was more like I messed it up a little bit the first time, so I'm gonna do it again. And welcome. It is the Maple Syrup Show. Sorry we're a little bit late. We had some computer issues. I don't know what's happening, but the college that I work for seems to like to block certain addresses every now and then. So yeah, I have to get this whitelisted again. But
all that
anyway,
content you're trying to put out there, Sam, they have to block you.
Well, I mean, I actually used this to teach all of my classes when there wasn't Zoom integration. Like we didn't have Zoom at the college, like a college-wide thing. I had Zoom as a personal thing, but I actually used this and Facebook to teach courses for a whole semester.
I could see that.
It actually worked really well because people could ask me questions, right? And they'd come up in the chat and all that kind of stuff. It definitely was not as good as Zoom is for what we do now, but it was all right. It was totally fine. Anyway, enough about my tech worries. But today we're here with David, and we're inside the industry, and we're going to welcome David Plamondon to the show. Welcome. How are you, sir?
I'm doing real well. How are you?
I'm okay. I'm all right. Erica, how are you?
I'm good. I need more sunlight. I need that. I definitely need more sunlight, but I'm doing well otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, like, your office is in the basement, but you have a walkout. But it's snowing.
It's under a deck. It just in general, I think I need to go outside during like regular daylight hours more often.
I have one of these, Erica, like my sun lamp to blind me, but B, because I am probably a little bit seasonal affect disorder person myself. So there you go.
Yeah. I need sunlight soon.
Hey, welcome to Helena Capel, who's watching the show from Toronto, Ontario, Canada. If anybody else is watching, make sure you let us know. Amy Bayo, Amy's game that she did with her son called Lost for Words launched on Kickstarter yesterday, so go check it out. Adam Young is here. Welcome, Adam, from the Sarnia area. And let's talk to David. David, tell us about what you're doing in the industry, how you got started, and what is it all about at Metawe Games?
Sure. Feels weird to be referred to as somebody who's working in the industry, but I guess it's technically accurate. I'll start a little bit with the background of Medway. So Medway Games, before I talk about Medway Games, I have to talk about Medway Consulting. So in April of 2019, my business partner, Jade Gravel, and I had been approached by one of the local Indigenous nonprofit organizations, the Treaty 8 Urban Office, which is a child and family service office that is working towards creating more of a sovereign control over child welfare when it comes to citizens of Treaty 8, to youth of Treaty 8 specifically. And so they had wanted us to do some youth engagement work, build a platform where the Treaty 8 youth can connect with one another, provide access to resources, information on education, life skills, things like that. And I was actually working full-time at the time, but I'd already had a long working relationship with Treaty 8. And so I reached out to Jade and I let her know that, there was an interest there and that I was interested in pursuing it as a consultant, but I wasn't able to take it on myself. So we chatted, reached out to a few other people that we had worked with in the past, and formed Medway Consulting. So it was really driven from that initial need. Now, when we sat down to talk about Medway Consulting, doing social media engagement, building like social media platforms wasn't really something that either of us were interested in doing. So we really talked about what did we want to do with a consulting group. If we were going to do, in a perfect world, if we could do whatever we wanted to do, what's the work that we want to do? And so Jade's background is sports rec and tourism from the University of Alberta here in Edmonton. And she's really engaged by youth engagement, by workshop development, by community engagement work. And for me, obviously, I grew up a huge gamer, playing D&D since my early teens, moving into board games into my 20s. And so we talked about how could we meld those two things. And our initial vision, our initial conversation was really focused on utilizing tabletop games as a way to do team building activities. So, Sen, you work at a post-secondary. I'm sure you've been to a number of really cheesy team building things where they have you build paper airplanes in a assembly line, or whatever other countless boring activities they have you do. And I thought, well, what if we implemented tabletop games in team building activities and made them not only fun, but actually meaningful and impactful. And with Jade's background in education, workshop development, she could actually approach it from a more academic side of things. And as somebody who loves games, I can tackle it from more on the game side of things. And I'm embarrassed to admit that it wasn't until about 2 weeks into the conversation that I finally clicked and I said, why are we thinking about this from a corporate engagement standpoint when we already have a connection with a youth agency that works specifically with youth? Why don't we tackle this as a youth focused approach? And so that's where Medway really was born, was the idea of taking tabletop games and utilizing them as skill development for youth, as a way of helping build foundational skills. So communication, leadership, collaboration, numeracy, literacy. I mean, as gamers yourselves, the sky's the limit when it comes to the sort of things that tabletop games can help reinforce. And so that's where it was born. And so we came up with the name Plamondon, which is Cree, which means come and play. And so it was really right from the very core of the naming. We wanted to reflect that, we are about utilizing play as a way of engaging and building those skills and building a community. So the first year of Medway was really focused, unfortunately, on doing that social media engagement work. We built a very small team led by Jade and myself, both of us kind of approaching it part-time. And we continue to think about how we can refine and develop the model. Now, Jade was finishing her degree in sports rec and tourism and did her last semester abroad, going into 2020. So I was kind of left to helm the ship solo. She was still supporting remotely, but built a couple other people onto the team. And then we started approaching some of the local schools here and talking about what we wanted to do. And there's a lot of strong interest from the schools to have us come in and deliver some workshops. Of course, we were looking at it as a pro bono thing to start with, just so we could build a model and get some testimonials, get some feedback, and improve the model. So that was going into February of 2020, and I'm sure everybody remembers what happened in February of 2020.
What happened in February of 2020?
And so the pandemic kind of basically hit the brakes hard on our ability to approach that initial model. So we kind of pulled back and we thought, okay, well, we can't go into schools now, obviously, right at the start of a pandemic. And there's still obviously a lot of uncertainty. This was back in, again, 2020, when everyone's like, oh, this will blow over in 2 months. Everyone will be responsible. Everyone will do their part and everybody will pitch in and wear a mask. And, this will be over in 8 weeks. So of course that didn't happen.
SpongeBob like 2 years later.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that. I use those all the time in class. the slides.
Oh, they're so appropriate.
They totally are.
Yeah, so we basically since then have gone in about 45 different directions, and I won't bore people in all of them, but we have been successful in delivering some great online workshops. Specifically what Jade developed in response to some requests from some schools here was a great Indigenous allyship workshop, which has nothing to do with games, unfortunately, but really focuses on helping educate non-Indigenous people and non-Indigenous organizations on the history of colonization and how that impacts Indigenous people and the systematic impacts that it has had on Indigenous people throughout the last 200 years or 150 years. But we did also have some great opportunities to work with some great, engineering firms, actually, and a couple other organizations in delivering some team building activities. We did a little 3-session D&D arc for a small engineering firm here in Edmonton, and we did another great team building activity for about 30 employees for Enbridge, which it was their Edmonton team, but it was a national course company. And so, we've had some successes there. But as we moved along the path of Medway Consulting, one of the things we wanted to do was be able to also provide curated lists and foundational support for educators, for librarians, for teachers, for community service workers, anybody who's working with young people, and be able to be subject matter experts and provide some curated recommendations and also some guides on how to implement tabletop games in the way that we had always envisioned as a tool for learning and building foundational skills. So we started reaching out to distributors in Canada here, and the feedback we got almost universally from the two kind of major distributors and some of the smaller ones was, hey, this sounds fantastic. What you're doing sounds really cool. We can't work with you. Most distributors in Canada, and I think it's the same in the United States, will only work with a retailer if they have a traditional brick and mortar setup. So that was the roadblock we had. And so we were operating out of a little 400 square foot office on the second floor of a little drab office park building. And so we got a little sign that Medway Games, private gaming space, and we built a custom gaming table in our little 400 square foot office and basically said, hey, look, we're a curated gaming space now. And we reached out to some of the community and said, why don't you come into this was pre-pandemic, so I should say, I'm getting my timelines a little blurred, but this was going into end of 2019. We started doing this. Why don't you come in and check out our space and play some games here. And you know, we built a little community in that little 400 square foot office. And one of the main distributors did say, hey, no, this is good enough. And they started selling to us. And then the other one said, nope. And anyone who works in the industry will know which distributor I'm talking about, that was extremely rigid and said, not only do you have to have a brick and mortar retail store, we want to see a lease, we want to see signage up, and we want to see shelving, and we want to see like a cash register before we'll even
that's
consider
like someone
it.
who got like not just like scammed, but like burned so hard that everybody now has to prove themselves.
Well, they kept moving the goalposts. They were like, at first there was like, we want to see a lease and signage, so we got,
or just making it hard. I mean, it's one of the two.
Yeah.
So we did that, and so we started talking, and we said, you know what, let's if we're going to be serious about this, then we have to go all the way. And you know, when we originally talked about Medway Consulting, a brick and mortar retail space was never in the vision of it. But the more we talked about it, the more it made sense, especially because we are a community focused business and we wanted to be able to do community focused events. So having a bigger space than 400 square feet made a lot of sense. So we started looking around. We were very lucky. I know your show's national, but for anyone familiar with Edmonton, we were very lucky to find a very great space in a very community focused neighborhood here in Edmonton called Alberta Avenue. It is an area that has a lot of challenges, houselessness, addictions, but it's also a neighborhood where the businesses are mostly independent and they really care about one another. And I know Sean M is in the chat right now.
Yep.
And Sean actually lives just a few blocks from us here, one of our early supporters of the store and one of our most valued members of our community. So we found this space. It was 2,900 square feet. It's in a corner lot right on the west end of Alberta Avenue, and you can see behind me here all this natural wood kind of runs through along the entire length of the shop here. So it's got a really nice rustic feel up front. Privately owned, so we're dealing directly with the landlord. Rent is very reasonable, and it's 2,900 square feet, which was really important to us because we wanted to make sure that we still had space for the consulting work. So we signed the lease, I want to say for November 1st, 2020, still, again, right in the heart of the pandemic. And we started doing some renovations, put up a couple demising walls internally to create 2 little private gaming rooms, a public gaming space, and then a very small retail storefront. I think our retail storefront's only about maybe 1,000 square feet, maybe 1,200. So retail was still something that we're doing, but it's not what we care about, if that makes sense.
Oh yeah, that makes total sense to me.
Yes, it's not your main focus, but it's something that it's part of the business.
Yeah. And so when we started moving into retail, one of the things we always talked about is we want to decolonize the approach to capitalism, to commerce, to retail. So it's been really tricky. It's very difficult to run a retail store, retail gaming store, especially because it's such a niche hobby, in a way that doesn't feel manipulative, doesn't feel capitalistic. We try to be very mindful of our pricing, keep a very consistent pricing model. We try to be very transparent with how we operate, with why we operate, and try to create a really big value add for our customers in terms of honesty, transparency, and just like being very upfront with things. And so it's been successful. I think people seem to really like our approach. One of the key things for us, and actually when we first opened up, there was obviously a lot of interest from the local media here because we were an Indigenous games store. We had an Indigenous name on our signage. It has Cree syllabics, so it's very visibly Indigenous. But we're also very focused on creating a space where people feel welcome. And this is where I got a lot of pushback, because I would do interviews and I would say, our goal with Medway Games is to create a space where everybody feels welcome. People of color, Indigenous people, people with disabilities, the LGBTQ plus community. And then of course, everyone came out of the woodworks and say, well, how dare you apply that, my favorite game store isn't inclusive or doesn't welcome, people of whatever community. It's just like,
see that as a challenge.
That's how people interpreted it.
It's a fascinating interpretation.
Yeah.
Well, and like I'm Indigenous. I've been indoors for the last 2 years, so I don't have a tan anymore. I'm what we call white passing, right? And I'm also straight, and I'm I forget the term now because I will apologize. I do have COVID. I'm just coming off of COVID here, so I've been isolating. But identify as male. I know there's a term for it. I just can't remember. Cisgendered. Yes, I'm cisgendered, straight. Thank you. And so I haven't really ever felt particularly excluded in the community. But I know that my experience is everybody else's experience, and I think that's what some people tend to forget, is that just because your experience hasn't been that you felt excluded from the community doesn't mean that there aren't tons of other people that have felt excluded. And so that was something that we were very intentional of. And so there's a lot of things when we open up the store that we were mindful of. One, and again, I think it was Sean actually in the chat here who donated us a pride flag. And so we have a pride flag hanging over the entrance to our private gaming area or public gaming area, which is typically the first thing people see when they come in the store, just a giant pride flag. And we have Emily, who's our retail coordinator, printed a nice vinyl pride sticker, and we put it right on the front door. And so it's things like that. Like, we're very upfront with our politics. We're very upfront with what's important to us. And that really comes down to equality and creating a space for everyone to feel welcome. And I saw a lot of discourse both for and against what I was saying, what our message was when we opened. And one thing that really resonated with me was there's a difference between being actively inclusive and not being proactively exclusive. And I think that's where a lot of people lose the thread when they're talking about the hobby or the average game store, whether or not your game store is, exclusive. Like, your game store may not say, no people of color, nobody from the LGBTQ plus community. They may not have a sign that says that, but that doesn't mean that isn't the vibe when people of those communities go into the store.
Right.
And I think it's reflective of the type of demographic that your store caters to. And obviously I don't like to speak in generalities, but I think we've all had experiences where there's a specific type of demographic that congregates at some stores. And I know that there's a lot of great stores that are improving and increasing their diversity and the type of people that get into the hobby. But again, having been in this hobby for 25 years, I've seen, kind of the worst of it. And so, that's our approach, is to be actively inclusive rather than passively inclusive. And I think it's things like that that are important to the hobby. And I think it's important to be always intentional and thoughtful of how your store is perceived or how your community is perceived and how you want to be looked at from the broader community.
No, I totally agree. So on this show, we've had the mandate and, stated the mandate for so many years that this particular show, while it's Canadian and all that, is really to uplift marginalized voices in the community, get people to know some of the names and faces of people that they don't know the names and faces of.
These people exist, their jobs exist, things like that.
These communities exist. And we want to see all of that because, my parents are immigrants to Canada, and lots of people are immigrants to Canada. And I think that that's what I love about Canada, is that we have such a broad population. And the thing about gaming and play, I was actually teaching a course today about early childhood and play. And the notion, I was just reading out my slide, and it's like, oh yeah, constructive play. Oh yeah, social role play, dramatic play, and formal rules. Like as you age, games change. But it's funny how role-playing games and these games that we play as adults actually have all of those things in them, right? So play is such a quintessential thing to human beings in general that it just strikes me as very interesting and almost kind of odd that there are some places that, while they're not, like you said, exclusive by a mandate or anything,
it's not intentional.
Not intentional. They might be a little bit exclusive by just who they tend to cater to and attract and all those kind of things. So I totally agree with the mission statement.
We've seen some positive changes, but the thing is that, I think we've all, at least especially the three faces on this one, walked into a room and been like, nobody in this room looks like me. And that is really, really intimidating. And it's not, again, that was just one of those passive things. It's not like someone said you don't belong here, but unfortunately that's what the impression gives. And you're right, that's actually where it becomes the active. No, but we've invited to make sure, you're not just going to be the only one that looks like you here.
Yeah.
It also becomes, it's also about gatekeeping as well. And like, I understand that when you're working in a niche industry, like specifically tabletop retail, the inclination is, well, I want to hire people that know about tabletop retail. I want to hire people that have been playing games for 25 years. And the problem is those people can come in with their own set preconceptions and their own set biases. And it may not be racial or gender or gender identity or any of that, but it can still be, well, this is the only type of game you should be playing, or that's a bad game. And that's another approach where, our staff, the majority of our staff don't have, our staff is very young. It skews to like early to mid 20s. So they're obviously not going to have the same depth of experience that I have in the hobby, just by sheer numbers. But we don't hire people based on, how much do you know about games, or, how deep is your knowledge of, 5th edition D&D, or, quote to me, what the thaco of a kobold is when they're at their level. You know what I mean? It's not that.
Taco.
It's how personable are you, and how much do you care about creating a positive experience for our customers. And that's really the approach that we've had. And so, our team has grown very organically, and really it's about people that want to work here. Our most recent team member, Jeffrey, was somebody who had heard about the store and was really excited about what we were doing, and came in and introduced himself and said, I'm working at Earl's right now, and I just love what you're doing, and if there's ever an opportunity to join the team, I'd love to. And so, we just didn't have capacity when he first came in, but we kept in contact with him for about 6 months, and now he's joined the team. And not only is he fantastic in the retail work that he does, but he's also moved over to the consulting side of things as well, and has brought a ton of experience and knowledge and perspective to that. And so, like I said, it comes down to, there's just so many different aspects of it that go into creating an inclusive space and a welcoming space. And it's all about not just the things that you can see tangibly, like the pride flag, like things like that, but it's also that intangible of who is your team, and what is their approach, and what are your values, and making sure that you're making those clear. And for us, again, it's decolonizing the approach to retail. We don't push games on people. We don't say, well, you should buy this or you need to buy that. It's a very soft sell, and it's just, if people come in, we welcome them. We ask them if they have questions, they can ask us, but otherwise we just leave them alone. If they want to browse, they'll browse. If they want to ask questions, they'll ask questions. It goes against my nature sometimes, because I'm very much a talker, and I very much like to share my opinion with things. So it can be challenging for me to resist that, because I don't want people to get the wrong impression when I'm trying to offer my feedback, but something I'm working on personally.
It's a personal goal for 2022. Adam Young says, we've enjoyed the Twitch streams when we were able to catch them. Always appreciate the real talk about inclusivity, etc. And then Jennifer, who I'm guessing that you know this, Jennifer?
I know her a little bit.
Yeah, just a little bit. She says that I found most game stores to be unintentionally intimidating. I think that's a good way to phrase it, right? They don't necessarily mean to be, but they can be, especially to people who are not already knowledgeable about the hobby. How friendly a game store tends to be dependent on what the staff are into. Yeah, I agree. So now that we know, where this whole thing kind of came from, what is the philosophy that you hold towards community outreach, in terms of the day-to-day nitty-gritty, and then the overarching principles behind all of that?
Yeah, so it's twofold. Because there's obviously the consulting side and the game side. I'll talk mostly about the game side, I think, because I think it's more relevant to the people that are watching. But for us, it's, like I said, creating an inclusive space. It's about making people aware that we're here without being super aggressive about it. And it's always about that decolonization of the way traditional capitalism works. We've toyed around with Facebook advertising, and when we first opened up, there was another gaming store local to us that had opened up just a few months before, and just that kind of inborn inherent capitalist brain of mine was like, well, I got to watch what their Facebook likes look like, and we got to get more Facebook likes than they do. But at the end of the day, it's really just about wanting Medway Games to be a space that people want to connect with. And whatever that connection looks like, it doesn't really matter. So just an example today, Emily had somebody come in earlier, and they were asking about adult coloring books, and they just liked the energy and the vibe of the space. And they said, they'd love to just come in and color here. And it was that's what we want to be.
Yeah.
I don't care if people are coming in and they spend an hour looking at games, if they spend an hour talking to Jillian about, what her favorite game is and just chatting, or if they come in and spend $300. It doesn't matter to me. What matters to me is the experience that they have when they're here. And that they feel like we're contributing positively to the community. And that's really what our goal is. Again, we still have to balance that, because we are still a business. We're not a nonprofit. We don't have donations. But we have to I always want to be mindful of, there's no point in being in this space. And what I mean, and when I say that, I don't mean just physically on Alberta Avenue, but, in this space, in the industry, if we're not remaining authentic to who we are and what our values are. So that's really what it comes down to, is just always keeping in mind what our end goal is, which is to create positive change overall in the industry. And I recognize that we're a small store. We're in we're in a crowded market here in Edmonton. So there's only so much change we can do. And we're not going to reach everybody. But every positive interaction we have, every positive experience we have, every family that comes in, or every new person that we help introduce to the hobby, is, for us a win. And that's really the metric that we want to be judged by, not how many games we sell in any given day, week, or month. I'll say on the consulting side, before the pandemic, right before we got shut down, when our ability to engage with an audience, with youth particularly, got shut down, we had an opportunity to go to a local, what are they called? Foster care agency.
Yep.
And we had delivered, I think there was like 7 or 8 kids that we had done a little 3-hour RPG session with running the Fate RPG system. And most of these kids had never even heard of RPGs. I think one of them or 2 of them like had played D&D before, and he was obviously super excited. And I saw myself in that kid, again, growing up in the 90s without, back when there was a huge stigma around role-playing games. But the enthusiasm and the energy and the excitement that those kids had walking out of that session, their first time playing role-playing games, like that's something they'll always remember. And being able to be a part of that was so magical and so important to why Jade and I originally started this work. And last summer, we were able to launch 2 summer camps for youth, running D&D summer camp. We had 2 groups of 5 kids each. One was like 10 to 12, and the other one was like 12 to 15. And again, just the enthusiasm, the excitement that those kids had. The older kids, I think, had all played D&D, so obviously a very different energy. They had a blast, but they really they put our DM through their paces in terms of like what his comfort level was with what they wanted to try to do. And then I was fortunate enough to run those 10 to 12 year olds, and there was 2 kids that again had never played D&D. They were super shy when they came in, but like just seeing the enthusiasm every morning when they'd come in and how they just couldn't wait to get back to the table and get involved in this adventure and roll dice and tell their stories and be the characters they wanted to be. And like, we were lucky that we were able to continue doing drop-in games for those kids on an online basis. We had to recently suspended because of staff changes, but again, those are things that those kids are always going to remember. And that's something that we got to be a part of and that we got to bring into their lives. And so it was so magical for us. That camp ended with an impromptu massive showdown. Because we were in 2 different groups and they were both running concurrently. And so we brought them together, and Abe, who was jamming the older group, Emily had built him a little costume so he could dress up like a dragon. And, we had all 10 of them sitting around the table. And Abe came in. I was the narrator, so I was the traditional GM, and then Abe was playing the role of the big showdown with the dragon. And they just had such an amazing time. And like we luckily were able to record it. We got consent from all the parents.
Fire on you.
Yeah, it was a white dragon, but
sorry. Cone of ice.
But yeah, it was just those are the kind of things that are important to us. Is just like creating those experiences because you can never take that away from somebody, and you can never overvalue how important that is especially to young kids, but even adults. We've had plenty of adults that have come in and people you wouldn't expect. And this is where creating a safe space and creating a welcoming space doesn't just apply to traditionally or historically underrepresented groups. I have a customer who comes in fairly regularly, and I grew up in Alberta, so I feel comfortable saying this, but like kind of like a very stereotypical white Albertan oil and gas worker, has that accent you'd expect, and that kind of rough around the edges, but he was really interested in role-playing games and came in, and I was lucky enough to be here, and I started chatting with him and talked about what he was looking to do, and he ended up picking up one of the Dungeons and Dragons board games, and he's come in a few times since and was just over the moon about how happy he was about being able to find the game and being able to talk to somebody. And again, that's a stigma that I can relate to. I grew up in a small town in northern Alberta. I grew up in the 90s. I was, socially anxious, a lot of social anxiety. So D&D was always an escape for me. But again, growing up in a small town in the mid 90s, there was nobody to play with. So for me, the escape was just buying the books and reading the books and dreaming someday about being able to play with somebody. And so, I recognize that stigma, and, I recognize, especially older people, there's still a stigma. I mean, the hobby's gotten so much more acceptable socially, but there is still that inherent stigma for some people. And so, being able to be that space for whoever it is, whether it's a 10-year-old that has never played a board game or a 40-year-old who has always wanted to try D&D but didn't know how, that's where we want to be.
Yeah. And I think you're totally on the mark about experience and those memories that you're creating through telling stories and playing games being like long lasting and more powerful than you can even imagine in some cases, right?
Sometimes they're almost like little therapy sessions if you really think about it, right? Because when you get to live either live through the character vicariously, whatever it is, right? It's amazing how much people don't realize that it's not just about the social interaction, it's how much you're honestly working through things yourself, right? There's like personal growth that can happen, which is,
Sure.
I mean, I think that's what the commitment is for so many people. You think about like the emotional investment you gave to this, you know?
Well, and we're not social workers, and we don't have, nobody in our team has that background, but I mean, that's an area that we'd like to explore, especially with some of our Indigenous communities.
Yeah.
And when you talk about Indigenous communities and you talk about Indigenous people, you know, there's a term that comes up a lot, intergenerational trauma, which means that, you know, and I've heard it summarized in a bunch of different ways, but the one that I think always resonates with me is that hurt people hurt people. And so when you look at the impacts of colonization and how that impacts, you know, older Indigenous people, survivors of residential schools, survivors of the 60s scoop, survivors of all of the different effects of colonization and all of the acts of genocide that have been committed on Indigenous people, you have a lot of inherent trauma, and that trauma gets passed down from generation to generation. And so an area I'd really like to explore is to utilize games as a space to help build a foundation of communication and connection. Because, you know, as somebody, again, I grew up with a lot of social anxiety. And I think one thing that I always appreciated about tabletop games is that they create a space for social interaction.
Mm-hmm.
And for people that have trouble navigating social cues or social interactions or don't know what the norms are, a tabletop game can give you a perfect structure and a set of rules that we're all agreeing upon. And this is how you're going to interact with one another. So if I don't know how to talk to you, you put a game in front of me and show me what the rules are. At least now we have a common ground that we can utilize as a base. And I think there's a lot of opportunity there that's currently unexplored, to utilize that as a space to help heal some of that intergenerational trauma and help with family reunification.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I mean, ultimately, that's somewhere I'd like to be in. Somewhat stymied by my lack of experience in social work and that background, but I think that there's a lot of opportunity there, and that's why we want to continue to build our relationships with community organizations and with Indigenous organizations, and you know, someday see more of that.
Yeah. Amy Bayo says games can give the framework to connect. So she's quoting you she thinks it's such a lovely idea. I will just tell you that we are working on a game called Venture Village through Ninth Level Games. Heather was supposed to be here next week, but she can't, so we're going to push it back a little bit. It'll be on Kickstarter at some point, but it is a role-playing game that is specifically built for teachers, therapists, parents to work on social emotional learning in children. So that may be a good place to start. There's a bunch of therapists and people like that on the team, like myself. So we're all kind of doing all this stuff in the hope that, you know, so role-playing games are therapeutic. I wouldn't call them therapy, but they can be used as therapeutic tools when there's enough guidance, right? So I think there's a real space there, like you're saying, David, for the inclusion of games as a modality to look into these areas of pain and trauma and all these things. There's lots of evidence in, say, like the autism population where games are used that way. So I think you're right. I think there's a lot of space there for these things when we talk about like indigeneity, indigenous ways of learning, all those things. I think if we could make something of that fit for that population, for the population specifically, and then come out of there and broaden that a little bit, maybe that would be something that could be really, really useful to help heal the pain, right?
Yep, and I'm sure you already heard of it, but Critical Core out of the United States is it was a Kickstarter, I think 18 months ago, that was specifically designed to create a 5th edition compatible role-playing game system, specifically designed for people with autism, for children with autism, and built in a way that is scientifically and foundationally built around some of the challenges that people with autism might have, and create a foundational role-playing tool that is designed for them. And so again, that exists in a space that we very much want to be active in. We have a lot of communities here, community organizations in Edmonton that work with children with autism, and so again, being able to be that connecting piece and help bring those into that education space, excuse me. And then of course, Coyote and Crow, just talking about indigeneity. You know, I never like to lean on capitalism as an excuse of why something should happen or should be accepted. But when you look at the success of Coyote and Crow,
Oh my
Their
gosh.
Kickstarter raised over $1 million. There's an appetite for diverse representation. There's an appetite for Indigenous representation, again, on both sides of the table. Nunami, designed by Thomas Mangiac in northern Quebec, didn't do as much on Kickstarter, but I know subsequently has had an amazing uptick in sales. I think he sold out of all of his American stock, and it's a game that's been our number one seller. I mean, partially because we talk to everyone we can about it, but so there is an appetite. So
Yeah.
even if your motivations aren't selfless, or even if they aren't motivated by wanting to create a better industry, even if they're motivated purely by profit, which I know for some people in the industry it is, there is an appetite for it. There's a financial demand for it, and so it's just an untapped market, which unfortunately is the reality that most Indigenous people or Indigenous industries face on a day-to-day basis. But yeah, there's an appetite for it for sure.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
So-
it's great to see that. I mean, if anyone's following what's going on with Coyote and Crow 2, there's more games even coming through that line. And you're absolutely right. It's like, I mean, the proof is like there is plenty of audience for this. And anyone who was hesitant before that thought maybe this was not the subject matter, obviously that is not the barrier here. So, it'll be at least a great case going forward to say, like, that's not the excuse anymore, though.
Right. And for those of you who are listening who might be designers interested in that, I know that Coyote and Crow is definitely looking to work with people. So look out for them for some good asks for new designers, writers, people, especially if you are part of the Indigenous community. Yeah, Connor Alexander is great, says Andrew Wolf.
See if that makes the magic.
You are correct.
Sometimes that works.
Sometimes it does work. Connor does watch the show often, so there you go.
I've had the good fortune of working with Connor, Medway House, I should say.
Yeah.
We've had some great opportunities to support the work that Connor and his team is doing. And they've got big plans for the Coyote and Co franchise. I don't want to speak to their plans, obviously, but yeah, the work that Connor's been doing has been inspiring. And there's other great Indigenous, like I said, Thomasy is another one. Nichelle Schneider is a great indie RPG designer who does work in the Blades in the Dark world, and I know that she's trying to create a better framework to bring together Indigenous designers, kind of what Connor is succeeding in doing, but in a little bit of a broader context, just because obviously Connor wants to keep focus on building Coyote and Crow, which I think is fantastic. But I think it's also important, while it's important to keep creating new Indigenous IPs and content, it's also important to represent Indigenous people in existing spaces. So in D&D, in Blades in the Dark, and whatever franchise. So
yeah, totally. I agree. So let's move on to that actual topic, like Indigenous representation in the hobby. We just sort of segued right in there. What's your thought currently on where it's going? What would you like to see? What kind of things are things that designers and graphic artists and illustrators can do to make you pick up a game and say, I feel seen, as opposed to, oh my gosh, put it back down. That is hot garbage.
Well, I mean, there's a lot to that. There's a lot to unpack in that, and I could talk about that all day. I mean, first and foremost, what I'd like to see is more Indigenous designers, more Indigenous artists, more Indigenous writers, more Indigenous creators, but also more Indigenous representation in the games themselves. When for us, we try to highlight games that have positive representation for Indigenous people, for the LGBTQ plus community. And of course, there's just not a ton. We have a little small table. It's thankfully growing, but that represents the LGBTQ plus community because it's really important to us. And there's just not enough games for us to justify having an Indigenous representation game. I can count them off off the top of my head. Nunami obviously is kind of the key. Coyote and Crow once it launches. When Decay is really good. I'm drawing a blank now. Inuit the Snowfolk is another really great one. There's a new one that just came out that we have just put an order in for, but Three Sisters, which isn't specifically Indigenous, but is based off of the traditional practice of blending those three agricultural blends. Yeah. And so, that game in particular, that and Wendake, I believe, did a lot of work with connecting with Indigenous people and having kind of their perspective and their feedback, so giving them a voice. Second best thing, of course, to having an actual Indigenous designer, but again, it's still a niche hobby. One of the challenges, and it becomes a chicken and egg thing when it comes to Indigenous representation, is that if Indigenous people don't feel like they're welcomed in the space, and they feel that they're wanted in the space, then they're not going to be interested in the space, which means you're going to have less Indigenous people interested in game design. And so it becomes that chicken and egg thing. Publishers don't necessarily want to cater to that audience because they are a minority in Canada. It's somewhere between 5 to 7%, upwards of 10 in some places. And so when you're already dealing with a niche hobby, the last thing a publisher wants to do is invest heavily in a niche of a niche of a niche. So in a perfect world, what I'd like to see is more Indigenous designers, more Indigenous creatives. And I think what Connor's doing is really paving the way to encourage that and showing again that there's an appetite for that. Beyond that, I'd like more consideration given to how Indigenous people are represented in games. And I'll use Great Western Trail as an example. Now, full disclosure, I think Great Western Trail is a fantastic game. I really enjoy it. But when you look at the redesign and when you, and full disclosure, I haven't played second edition. I haven't seen second edition yet. I know it's been difficult to get, but my understanding is, and feel free to correct me in the chat if I'm mistaken here, but their approach was to address some of the problematic representation in the game by adding more diversity, more people of color in the representation of the workers. And I think probably more female representation. And for anyone who's played Great Western Trail, there are hazards, there's rock slides, there's floods, and then there are Indians, which is the term. I don't know if the game uses it, but I mean, at the time, historically, that would have been the term that was used. And they basically just represent barriers that are placed on the map. And so their solution to address that was to remove them and replace them with bandits. Now, to me, that really doesn't solve the problem. And it really highlights what the problem is in that how they were looked at from a design standpoint. They are a barrier to overcome. Now, obviously, historically,
they are the bad guys, no matter how which way they were like.
Yeah, and now it's erasure of the issue, right?
Yeah, exactly. So instead of addressing the issue, instead of like shifting the narrative or shifting the focus, they just said, "Oh, well, just take Indians out and put bandits in, and problem solved." Now the Indians aren't in there, so here, A, erasing history, and B, like it doesn't solve the root of the problem. Was that Indigenous people were not a barrier. I mean, again, from a colonial standpoint, they were a barrier to overcome, but it doesn't have to be that narrative,
right?
And that's what I love about Wendicay, which is not an Indigenous design game, but it's a game that is framed from the perspective of Indigenous people, and it actually flips the stereotype of what most games have, where Indigenous people are a backdrop or a barrier, and it actually puts the French and English War in the backdrop, and now you are playing one of the Huron tribes. And so, that's what I want to see more of. I want to see more historical representation of Indigenous people. And again, like I said, chicken and egg thing. I know there are some great companies out there. I don't want to mention them because I don't know where they're at, but we were approached by a fairly reputable company that had been looking at buying a license for an Indigenous design game that was focused on a specific cultural practice. I don't want to again give too much away here because I don't know where they're at with it. And they asked if we would be interested in coming on as consultants and provide some research and feedback. And so we were very excited about that opportunity. I don't know where things are at with that. The game itself was like a 2-player game, and the components were a little bit on the pricey side. So I think for that, it came down to a business case, which again makes sense to me. I don't want Indigenous games just for the sake of Indigenous games. I want good Indigenous games. I want games that are fun to play, that are based off of Indigenous history or culture or representation. And then you have bad examples of, maybe I'll make somebody mad by calling this out, but Netatonka, which is a game designed by a French company that is vaguely Indigenous. There's teepees and canoes and buffalo and headdresses and totem poles, and it just feels like they went on Google and just said like Indigenous stereotypes or Indigenous history, and then just kind of threw everything in together. Which again, unfortunately, it's a great game mechanically. I love it, but it could have been done so much better with just a little bit of consultation and a little bit of historical accuracy, rather than just this vaguely Indigenous vibe that really is like 90% North American Indigenous, and then like also has some like South American and like probably some like other Indigenous groups as well. Like there's a really weird blend in that game. And again, if you want to make a game that like, you can just make a fantasy game. You don't have to incorporate all of these real world examples in a way that's inauthentic and honestly blatantly and borderline offensive. I wouldn't say borderline, it's offensive, especially when held up to something like Wendake or Inuit the Snowfolk, or again the gold standard in my opinion is Nunami, because it was A, Indigenous designed, B, Indigenous themed, and C, a good game. And I
Right.
mean, those are really the things that we want to see.
So, is there anybody that you know, even in your community or the wider Indigenous community, that is looking to design games? Like, is there a way that we can reach out to them, that they
Almost
can
like
reach
make
out to
those
us,
connections.
that we can make connections for them and with them?
So there's a local group here called Shift Lab, and they have designed a game called Exploring with Cheetah, I believe is the name of it. And so the challenges, and I don't know where they're at with this. So when we first opened up, they reached out to us and said, "Hey, we'd love to have you play test the game and provide some feedback." And so they brought us like a very rough prototype, and it was a very interesting design. There's a lot of things we liked about it, but the challenge was that it was kind of an ongoing historical walk through the history of colonization in Western Canada here. And so, there was some gameplay, but really it was just kind of like a linear narrative experience. And so we played it a couple of times and we talked about it internally. And this was about a year ago.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, it really like, what are you looking to do with this game? Like, if you're looking to just have it as an educational tool, I think it's fine. As a game, it doesn't really have a lot of replayability because the events come out at certain times, and they have revised and refined it. I don't know where they're at with it, but Shift Lab is definitely somebody I would recommend reaching out to talk about their game, Exploring with Cheetah. And we've talked internally about taken a crack at designing a game. Emily and I one night just had like an hour-long brainstorm session about what we would look at from a game design perspective. And so Emily actually, I'm going to mute real quick. I'm going to yell at her and see if she can bring me the board. 1 second. Emily, do you know where your prototype board game is? I don't know if I muted when I yelled that. Sorry if everyone.
No, you didn't.
Sorry. The mute button's hard.
I think you tried, but then it wasn't.
I definitely tried. Anyway, so yeah, she has a really cool foundational idea for like a worker placement set drafting game. The problem is that like Emily and I are both really big idea people. I always tell people whenever, because I ask that a lot, have you ever thought about designing a game? You ever thought about doing this? And my response is always, I don't create things, I destroy things. So, I'm creative in specific ways. But when it comes to like game design, I've played tons of games and I love playing games. I just don't see me having the skill set. I think Emily definitely has the skill set to do it. But Emily is like, I make her wear a lot of different hats. Can I show this up? I make her wear a lot of different hats. And so it's really difficult for her to be able to focus on one project. But this was like something that she drafted up just as like a rough prototype. And like, this is something I could never do. Like, she did this in like 20 minutes. And so, I think there's some opportunity here. Game publishing is something we would love to do. She's wearing her hat from our D&D costume. But yeah, so this would be something that would be like, I'd be really excited to support and put whatever resources I can behind it, but it's not something that I can design. And we're super lucky to have people like Helena, with like Connor, people who work in the industry, Thomasy, who if we ever did get to the stage of wanting to design an Indigenous game, like we'd be able to pick their brains and get some direction. But yeah, I think what our role as Medway would be more of the either space to bring people together, or if we continue to grow our success as a business, we could definitely be somebody who could support from a financial standpoint, from a publishing standpoint, and help design from there.
Very cool. And I know that there are definitely designers out in the Edmonton area that we can link you up with if you need that. Roberta's out there, Roberta Taylor, she's wonderful. And there's lots of other designers out there as well. So yeah, it's a nice little community. Didn't we have another? We had more people from Edmonton just a couple weeks ago, didn't we?
We had Ilya.
Taylor and Ilya,
yeah. So actually, Ilya and Taylor started Covray right around the same time that we opened Medway, and we reached out to them right away and said, like our values are super in line with what you're doing, and they were big fans of what we were doing. Geographically, Edmonton's a very divisive city, and so they had bought a house, I think about 3 or 4 months ago. Hopefully, I'm not blowing up their spot, on the deep south side, and so they unfortunately just don't make it up here very much, which makes sense because they both work full time in addition to the work they're doing at Covray. But they still reach out to us pretty frequently. We signal boost all of their videos. I don't think they needed it at this point. It was funny at the time because I think when we first reached out to them, they were just starting Kavre, or they had just kind of launched Kavre as a blog. It was before they really launched into the video stuff. And so I think they were super excited about the idea of a retailer reaching out to them. And I think they kind of thought we were up here and they were down here. And I think in reality, like we were probably like both kind of right here, and now it feels like they're way up here and we're down here. I mean, but that's all perspective, and like none of that really matters to us, and I'm pretty confident it doesn't matter to them as well. But I think it was funny because I always try to be mindful of that when we reach out to like anybody, because it's really easy for people to see, you know, we've got a retail game store, like we look like we're adults doing serious things in the industry, and like in a sense we are, but I mean in the real sense, and anyone who's worked with our team knows that like it's really just a pirate ship of misfits that are just kind of navigating choppy waters on a day-to-day basis, and that's really all we're doing.
The game industry in general anyway, and people just don't know that.
Right. Oh, wow. Look at this. My battery's at 6% and the power cord is in another room. So just in case we might lose this. Adam Young actually asked a really good question. He said that he was worried about checking out games like Wendake because it wasn't designed by folks with Indigenous backgrounds. And he asks...
Uh-oh.
Oh, no.
They got him. He's asking the hard questions. I'll ask the question here. So Adam was asking what differentiates Wendake from a game like Minnetonka, and then just mentioned that, you know, having curated indigenous curators or recommendations is important. What I'll say is that the original version of Wendake, I know that it's being published by Renegade now. I don't know who the original publisher was, but the original version that I have actually has about a 20-page or 10-page guide that talks about the historical research and background that went into the game. And for me, the big difference between Wendake and Minnetonka is that in Wendake, you were playing real historical Indigenous tribes in a real historical piece of history that happened. And you are playing from the perspective of Indigenous people who lived that experience. And so it's based off of that lived experience. Whereas Minnetonka is just, hey, wouldn't it be cool if there was this Minnetonka who's like this supreme elder, but then there's also 4 other elders, but everybody's Indigenous. So of course you're all working together because Indigenous people are always harmonious and spiritual. And so it's, you know, just kind of a weird amalgam of this European vision or perspective of what Indigenous people is without any actual research. So when you incorporate things like buffalo, canoes, teepees,
when it's super generalized, stereotypical, almost nonsense,
and it's all blended together, right?
Yeah.
And again, it leads to this whole idea of this mysticism, because the Minnetonka in the context of that game is this like supreme mystic who unifies all the tribes, and that's what you're competing for. And so, you know, that's what it comes down to for me. Again, I will say this is my perspective. I certainly don't want to be held as the authority on these sort of things. But that's, to me, what the difference between Wendake and Minnetonka is that authenticity and that historical representation and the intention behind it. The intention behind Wendake, in my interpretation and my reading of that historical guide that came with it, was Indigenous people in that Huron area have so much rich history, and this is teaching you about it. Whereas Minnetonka is, hey, aren't Indigenous people cool? Let's fetishize them. And I think that's really the difference for me.
Right, but I think it's fair, I mean, especially because it was asked, but also on top of that, you know, when people want to support something, they do want to kind of, it's hard to know what to support sometimes, especially, you know, as you're getting into, you know, more part of that community or culture yourself. So you kind of do need those guideposts of, this is why this is not the right place to start, because you're going to get the wrong impression, or this is not a good representation, right? And so I think it's great. I mean, that's why you need people to say, this is great for this reason, this is great for this reason, this is maybe why this would not be great for you. You know, obviously, you know, we can always say, in my humble opinion, but ultimately it's saying, compared to what everything else is out there, this is why this is maybe not, shouldn't be held up where the other ones are.
Well, and I'm also not here to yuck anybody's yum. You know, if you want to buy games like Puerto Rico, I think I've never played it, but I think that's the one that's about slave trading. I mean, you know, do you?
Yeah, they definitely have, there's definitely slaves in that one.
Yeah,
that one is it's very interesting when you dissect it.
I have a very divisive opinion on Spirit Island that I get a lot of flack for when I get into online arguments about it. Everyone holds Spirit Island up as this paragon of like anti-colonialism, and on its surface, sure, it paints colonial people as bad, and it puts you in the position of putting them as the bad guys. But when you look at Spirit Island, from a deeper perspective, it still suffers from the same problems that I'm complaining about with Great Western Trail, in that the Dahani in Spirit Island are a passive group that have no agency. And the only way that they can survive colonization is by these mysterious forces coming in and saving them and
Someone else
positioning
has
them
the
and maneuvering them. And it's that, it's that white saviordom, except that instead of white people, it's these mystical spirits. And that leans on the other problem that I have with Spirit Island, is that it again fetishizes and creates this idea of all Indigenous people are mysterious and spiritual and can command the elements. And so again, is it a step in the right direction? Absolutely, because it is showing colonization in the negative light that it holds for most Indigenous people and most Indigenous communities. But again, it's a step in the right direction, but also a little bit left of where we want to be, where we want to have Indigenous people empowered and put in the position to take care of themselves, not have to have that external party come in and do the thing for them.
Yeah, a lot of times when we're talking about this, we're talking about like the agency of the oppressed people. Like, if you have oppressed people in your game for whatever reason, what can they do about that oppression? Right? What is the agency that they have? And that's a really good question. A, why are you doing this? And then B, if you are going to do this, how do the oppressed people have agency to make change for themselves, not just be rescued, not just be some mystical, magical people.
Shaman. Someone will always have the magical answer, right?
Right. It's not always magic. Not always.
And the Dahani have no agency.
It's not all magic.
Yeah, and exactly, right. So if you have no agency, it makes it feel very much like, that you were saved by something else, right?
And in Wendake, there's spirituality. There's masks that have like spiritual context. There's ceremony, which exists in indigenous culture, but there's no mysticism. There's no magical spirits that come in. It's all grounded in traditional values, traditional beliefs, and traditional practices, without leaning on this mysticism that just doesn't exist in a way that isn't represented in other aspects of colonial games. Like we had Genotype, which we demoed for our stream not that long ago, and it's a game that really leans on the religious nature of original science, but when you have European religions in games, there's very rarely, I mean there's obviously some exceptions, but there's very rarely a mysticism that comes with it when it's non-indigenous non-indigenous spiritual practices. It's usually grounded in just traditional practices and not this mysticism, right? So
I get that. Andrew Wolf is asking, not board game related, but he's curious to hear your thoughts on Assassin's Creed 3, if you have an opinion.
I have so many opinions on Assassin's Creed 3.
Do we need another hour? I did plug my computer back in. I did plug it back in, so
there'll be a Twitch stream just for Andrew. All the reasons why there's a problem.
We might. So my primary problem with Assassin's Creed 3 was when you look at any quote unquote credible game journalists review of Assassin's Creed 3, it is universally panned as the worst of the Assassin's Creed games. And to me, that is very much rooted in I don't want to again, I don't like speaking generalities, but it feels like it's very much rooted in racism. I know one of the criticisms of, I believe Connor was the name of the main protagonist, was that he was very gruff and very to the point, and lacking in personality, which is somewhat intentional by the character's design. Nobody criticized Geralt.
Oh, from The Witcher?
Sorry,
from The Witcher, for being the exact same thing. But all of a sudden it's an indigenous character and he's like, well, he's got no personality. Yeah, because his entire history is rooted off of oppression and trauma.
He's gonna sing a dance for you. It'll be magical.
So is Geralt.
Yeah, I know. But
right?
Yeah.
It's an unrealistic expectation,
Yeah, and so I thought, I was over the moon when Assassin's Creed 3 came out, because now you finally have an indigenous character who's not Turok, which I can talk about all day too.
Son of Stone.
Yeah, exactly. Again, talking about mysticism and cliches. And I thought again, it was one of my favorite games. I thought it was super interesting to take on that period of history. And I think it was a really interesting look at the impacts of colonization and how it impacted indigenous people in a way that felt a little bit more authentic than a lot of looks that have been. And so, yeah, I think that game was unfairly criticized. And I think a lot of it was because it was an indigenous character. Not that I think that it should be, graded on a curve because it's got diversity. But I mean, when you look at the history of Assassin's Creed, they gave Ezio 3 games And they gave who was the pirate from Black Flag? They gave him and his son 2 games, and then Connor gets 1 game, and again, it's the one that's most universally panned. I thought it was super good. I loved it. I loved that representation. Again, it's something you don't see very often. I'm trying to muddle my way through Red Dead Redemption right now. I've not played very much of it, but as another game where I think early on in the game, again, I've only played like 3 chapters, but there's a part where they're traveling through and they see a trio of Indigenous people looking down on them, and they say they got a bad turn, and they put very upfront about like how shitty colonization has been for Indigenous people. Mm-hmm. So yeah, sorry, that's my rant about Assassin's Creed 3. I loved it. I thought it was great. I also will say that Assassin's Creed Rogue was a game that really flew under the radar because it launched on the 360 when the Xbox One had already come out. But
right.
Very strong feelings about Assassin's Creed 3.
Very strong feelings.
And then they come out with the Assassin's Creed board game, and who's in it? Fucking, pardon my language. Am I allowed to swear on this? I never actually.
You totally can. Go right ahead.
Okay. Sure. Fucking Ezio again. Like, enough with Ezio. I liked Assassin's Creed 2. I thought it was a huge step up from the original game, but then 2 more games for Ezio. I'm done with it. And then a board game.
Right. More Connor, or whatever that character's name is. So to wrap us up, what's next for you and Medway Games?
Oh man. I don't even, honestly, when I describe it as a pirate ship, like, honestly, that's really how we operate. I would say fundamentally, we want to continue to push the model of working with libraries and community groups. Being in Edmonton here, we have the very good fortune of having a fantastic video game company, BioWare, who's reached out to us about doing some team building activities for them, and they actually just donated $1,000 for the games through us, so we're going to just be the middle person to get those to schools and libraries.
Right.
Nice.
Yeah, I would say I'm hoping Emily follows through with her board game design. We're going to continue to support Coyote and Crow. We're going to continue to support Thomasy with whatever he does with Nunami. Yeah, I mean, there's so much potential for us. I wish I had a more cohesive answer. I think partly it's because of COVID, but it's honestly hard to pin down. Like, we've been so fluid since we started the consulting work. I guess if I want to try to give you a cohesive answer, I would say with Medway Games, we want to get to a space where it's maybe someday safe to actually have in-person events and be able to live our dream of actually like bringing people into the space and hosting game nights and building a community. And for Medway Consulting, we really want to continue to explore our ability and our opportunity to bring games to more of a consultative process and more of a skill development process, and implement those in a meaningful way and bring them to schools, libraries, and community organizations. What I'd especially like to do, pipe dream, money's no object. I don't have to live in a capitalist hellscape where I have to worry about paying my bills and everything like that. We would love to create kind of a mobile game library pop-up shop and take it out to Indigenous communities and be where they are. Living in Alberta and coming from Treaty 8 territory, originally in Northern Alberta, there are 22 Treaty 8 nations, and geographically speaking, they're scattered all around Northern Alberta, and a lot of them are very isolated.
Right.
And some of them are 90 minutes away from the nearest even small town. And so being able to bring games to the communities and introduce those games to community members and being able to show them what they're missing would be fantastic. And that's really what I'd love to do at some point when I can, live my best life. Well,
I hope that comes sooner than later. So where can people find you?
So we're on all of the traditional social media, Facebook, Twitter. We have a Twitch stream. So Medway Games, I think, is most of our social media channels. Emily decided to make it super difficult on Twitch. So it's Medway with us, which is the blending of Medway, which is come and play with us. We were real good in 2020 with staying consistent in the stream, but then with COVID and everything else, we have kind of fallen off. But we're going to come back to Twitch and then push all that out on YouTube. But yeah, if you just search Medway, I think you'll pretty much find us everywhere. We do have an online web store, medway.com/shop. We do $14 flat rate shipping anywhere in Canada. We do have a lot of cool niche stuff that a lot of other retailers just can't carry because it's not cost effective. I'd say pretty much 90% of the indie RPGs we sell at a loss. But again, my mandate is just to get cool stuff to people who want it. So
There you go.
Very nice.
Speaking of cool stuff, I think it's next week, and we'll find this out in a second or two when we do the coming up stream. Yes, it is next week when T. Kairos will be on, and T is the COO, CEO, I don't know, the C something 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 of
CO.
a very new company that is actually focusing on designing games for the LGBTQ plus community. So definitely
Next
link
week.
up with them. So that will be next week. And if you're looking for us, you can find me at Senfeng Lim on Twitter. Erica, where are you?
At Erica Buiris.
Excellent. And Alara is at TT Void. They will be back with us as much as they can. And if you're looking for Maple Syrup, we're all at Maple Syrup on Twitter. If you want to help us keep the lights on, you can support us at patreon.com/maple syrup. That'd be very nice. And we will use that money to good effect, not only to do all this stuff we do with the technology, but we also, I think, the goal is to do stuff live in person at conventions with people who want to design games. That's the goal.
That's the goal.
So we're building up a little pot until we can do that. David, do you have final advice for people out there who are watching the show, as designers, as writers, as role players, as whatever?
Yeah, I would say that the system that we live in right now, and when I speak the system, the capitalist system, is really just built on a foundation of lies. There's one thing that I've really tried to internalize over the last couple of years is that if you're passionate about doing something, if you have dreams or goals, you should just do it. It's been bordering on financial ruin for me, investing everything I have in Medway, but it's been so emotionally and spiritually rewarding. And just the more you put into something, the more you'll get out of it. So if there's something you're passionate about, use this as the inspiration to just do it. Success is really built on what you make it, and you need to decolonize your approach to what day-to-day life is, and not live in the system that you're born into, but create the system that you want to see going forward.
What great advice. Excellent. So let's take a look at what is coming up. I'm going to bring this up and put it on solo. So February 16th, we have the aforementioned T. Kairos from Snowbright Studios. That's the name of it. February 23rd, Amabel Holland is coming from Holland Spiel. March 2nd, it'll be myself, Alara, and Erica talking about low player count games. So solo, 2-player, no low. There is a no player game out there. We'll see what it's like.
I've heard, there's people talk about these games. I still think they're mythical, but
who knows? And then on March 9th, we have Dr. Lisa Walken and Peter Walken coming from Bolstered Leadership. March 16th, Dr. Scott Nicholson is coming from the Wilfrid Laurier University BGN Lab. And on March 23rd, Mikey Grenier from Which Game First talk about community building. So we've got lots of great folks coming on the show. Lots of voices, new voices, old voices. It's going to be really cool. We'll talk all about it then. Until then, we will see you later. It was so nice talking to you, David. Erica, great to see you. And we will see everybody else from the feed sooner than later, we hope.
oh,